Preface to the original editions. Hayek begins by saying plainly that The Road to Serfdom is a political book, written by an economist who had spent much of his professional life on technical theory. He wrote it because he believed Britain and other democratic countries were embracing ideas that had already helped destroy freedom in continental Europe. The book is addressed especially to socialists, not because Hayek doubts their motives, but because he thinks many people who sincerely value liberty misunderstand the institutional consequences of comprehensive economic planning. His argument is not that every public intervention leads immediately to dictatorship, or that laissez-faire is a complete political program. It is that a society which attempts to replace a competitive order with conscious direction of the whole economy must eventually make choices about the relative importance of millions of conflicting individual aims. Those choices cannot be settled merely by technical expertise. They require coercive political decisions. Hayek therefore asks readers to examine socialism not by its intended goals, but by the kind of power its execution requires. Forward to the 1956 American paperback edition. More than a decade after the book first appeared, Hayek reflects on how its argument should be understood in the United States. He emphasizes that he never intended the title as a prediction that any modest expansion of government would automatically produce totalitarianism. The warning concerns a direction of movement. If a society progressively substitutes compulsory central direction for decentralized choice, it creates institutional pressures that become harder to reverse as planning expands. Hayek also stresses that the historical circumstances of Britain and America differ from those of interwar Germany. The United States retains strong traditions of constitutionalism, federalism, individual responsibility, local government, and suspicion of concentrated power. These traditions make an abrupt totalitarian transformation unlikely, but they do not eliminate the underlying problem. Free institutions can be weakened gradually when governments accumulate discretionary power over economic life, and when citizens come to expect political authorities to allocate opportunities, incomes, and security. A major theme of the foreword is the distinction between a competitive system and a policy of passivity. Hayek rejects the caricature that liberalism means doing nothing. Government has essential functions: establishing a stable legal framework, protecting property and contract, preventing fraud and coercion, maintaining monetary stability, and supplying services that markets cannot adequately provide. It can also provide a minimum level of security against extreme hardship. The crucial distinction is between measures that establish general rules within which individuals make their own plans and measures that direct particular people toward particular ends. He therefore accepts that a modern society may legitimately organize social insurance against risks such as sickness, accident, or unavoidable unemployment. What concerns him is the attempt to guarantee particular standards of living or particular relative incomes by continuously controlling prices, wages, occupations, and production. A general safety net can be compatible with freedom, an economic system in which political authorities must continuously decide who deserves what tends to expand discretionary power. Hayek revisits the problem of monopoly for the same reason. Competition is not automatically perfect, and some industries may have technical features that make ordinary competition difficult. But he argues that governments often create or reinforce monopoly through tariffs, licensing, regulation, cartels, and privileges. The existence of monopoly should not be used as a blanket justification for replacing markets with comprehensive planning. Nor does public ownership by itself solve the political problem, because a public monopoly combines economic control with coercive state power. The larger concern remains moral and constitutional. Economic freedom matters not because consumption is the highest human value, but because control over material means affects almost every other purpose people pursue. A government that controls jobs, income, housing, production, and access to resources can influence religion, speech, family life, associations, and political dissent, without formally abolishing those liberties. Hayek therefore asks Americans not to interpret their prosperity or democratic traditions as guarantees that institutional tendencies do not matter. Freedom survives through rules and habits that disperse power, and those rules can be weakened one practical exception at a time. Preface to the 1976 edition. Looking back after more than 30 years, Hayek describes The Road to Serfdom as the beginning of a long intellectual shift in his work from pure economic theory toward political philosophy and the study of institutions. He acknowledges that the book was written rapidly during wartime, and that he would formulate parts of the argument differently later. In particular, he came to see more clearly that the alternative to central planning was not simply competition understood as a set of market outcomes, but a wider order of general rules, limited government, dispersed knowledge, and individual choice. He rejects the claim that events after the war made the warning irrelevant. Western democracies did not become totalitarian, but Hayek attributes part of this to a retreat from some of the most ambitious schemes of comprehensive planning and to the continuing resilience of liberal institutions. The book, he insists, should be read as an argument about mechanisms and tendencies rather than as a timetable for inevitable political collapse. Introduction. Hayek begins from the unsettling idea that nations can repeat intellectual paths whose consequences have already appeared elsewhere. Britain, he argues, had increasingly adopted ideas that Germans themselves had embraced before the rise of Nazism: distrust of competition, admiration for comprehensive organization, hostility to traditional liberalism, and faith that experts could consciously direct society toward agreed goals. The similarities were obscured because British observers tended to treat German totalitarianism as a uniquely German national pathology. Hayek reverses that interpretation. Germany had once been strongly influenced by European liberal traditions. Its later rejection of liberalism developed gradually through intellectual and political movements that celebrated organization, national purpose, planning, and the subordination of individuals to collective ends. The Nazi regime did not spring from an eternal German character. It emerged in a country that had moved away from institutions and ideas that restrained political power. This matters because the British public in the 1930s and 1940s often regarded socialism as the opposite of fascism. Hayek argues instead that socialism and fascism belong to the same broader collectivist family, when both seek comprehensive direction of economic and social life. Their goals and constituencies may differ profoundly, but both require someone to determine a common hierarchy of ends and to allocate resources accordingly. The conflict between them does not prove that their institutional logic is opposite. He is careful to distinguish this claim from an accusation about socialist motives. Many socialists are motivated by compassion and equality, and are deeply hostile to tyranny. His thesis is precisely that benevolent intentions cannot remove the coordination and coercion problems created by comprehensive planning. Once democratic agreement proves insufficient to settle the detailed choices required by a planned economy, pressure arises to delegate authority to experts or executives who can act without constant political obstruction. The book will therefore examine a sequence rather than a conspiracy: the abandonment of liberal principles, the belief that planning is inevitable, the conflict between planning and democracy, the erosion of the rule of law, the expansion of political control over personal life, the struggle over distributive claims, and finally the incentives that favor ruthless political leadership. Hayek's warning is addressed to societies that still possess freedom and can choose another direction. Chapter 1. The Abandoned Road. Hayek opens the main argument by claiming that European civilization had gradually abandoned the intellectual tradition that produced its modern freedom. The 19th century liberal order had rested on individualism in a specific sense. Not selfishness or social isolation, but respect for the individual as the ultimate judge of his own purposes, combined with limits on coercive power. It grew from Christianity, classical philosophy, the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the long struggle to free economic and intellectual activity from arbitrary authority. The liberal achievement was never a completed doctrine of laissez-faire. Its decisive institutional discovery was competition under general rules. Instead of requiring a central authority to assign each person a task, competitive markets allowed countless individuals to coordinate plans through prices while pursuing different goals. Economic freedom was connected to intellectual and political freedom because it reduced the number of decisions that had to be made collectively and coercively. Hayek argues that the extraordinary material progress of the 19th century helped undermine appreciation of this order. Once greater prosperity and freedom became familiar, people saw the remaining imperfections more clearly than the historical achievement itself. Poverty, insecurity, inequality, monopoly, and economic fluctuations appeared intolerable. Liberal institutions came to be judged against an imagined system in which conscious organization could remove every defect rather than against the poorer and more coercive arrangements that had preceded them. Socialism gained influence by promising to retain the achievements of liberal civilization while eliminating competition and inequality. Many intellectuals came to regard planning as the next progressive stage of history. The language of freedom itself changed. Earlier liberals had meant freedom from arbitrary coercion. Socialists increasingly used freedom to mean effective power to obtain desired material outcomes. The two ideas could sound similar while implying very different political institutions. Hayek stresses that liberalism does not deny the need for improvement. A functioning competitive system requires deliberate legal construction. Property, contract, corporations, money, bankruptcy, liability, and competition all depend on rules. Governments must prevent fraud and force, and may regulate harmful external effects, or provide services that cannot be supplied through ordinary pricing. The liberal mistake, where it occurred, was often dogmatic attachment to particular 19th century arrangements rather than continued improvement of the competitive framework. The road being abandoned is therefore not a perfect historical golden age. It is a set of principles: dispersed choice, competition, general law, skepticism toward concentrated authority, and tolerance for a plurality of ends. Hayek's claim is that losing these principles changes the structure of politics before it changes the formal constitution. When more and more questions become matters for collective decision, conflicts that markets once settled impersonally are transferred into struggles for political power. Chapter 2: The Great Utopia. The central paradox of socialism, in Hayek's account, is that it originally entered European politics as a movement suspicious of individual liberty. Early socialist writers frequently attacked competition, private property, and liberal individualism, precisely because these institutions limited conscious organization of society. In the 19th century, however, socialism gradually absorbed the language of freedom. It came to promise not only equality and security, but a new and supposedly more genuine liberty. This change made socialist planning especially attractive to liberals and Democrats. If economic planning could remove poverty and insecurity while preserving political freedoms, there appeared to be no fundamental conflict. Hayek argues that this expectation rested on ambiguity. Freedom in the older liberal sense means that a person is not subject to another person's arbitrary will. The newer economic sense often means possession of the resources necessary to satisfy wants. Material power can certainly enlarge a person's possibilities, but redistributing such power requires decisions about whose wants should receive priority. The historical development of continental socialism also weakens the idea that collectivism naturally allies with democracy. Socialist movements repeatedly confronted the problem that comprehensive planning requires unified direction. Fascists and National Socialists rejected socialism's internationalism and some of its distributive goals, but they shared its hostility to liberal individualism and competition. Former socialists could migrate into nationalist and fascist movements because the underlying preference for organized collective purpose remained. Hayek's argument is not that socialism and Nazism are morally identical. It is that they share institutional features when each attempts to subordinate decentralized individual decisions to a common plan. Once collective purpose becomes supreme, liberty can survive only where individual choices happen to agree with the plan. A society cannot promise that every person will be free to pursue his own values, while also insisting that all resources be organized according to a single hierarchy of social priorities. The utopia is therefore great not because its aims are contemptible, but because its promise is internally unstable. A planned society is expected to deliver equality, security, prosperity, democracy, and personal freedom simultaneously. Hayek's project is to show why the means chosen to realize this combination tend to undermine some of the ends that made the project attractive in the first place. Chapter 3: Individualism and Collectivism. Hayek next defines the conflict more precisely. Collectivism is not simply concerned for society, cooperation, or public action. It is the attempt to organize all the resources of society deliberately in accordance with a unified scale of priorities. Socialism is one form of collectivism, but nationalism, corporatism, and other doctrines can pursue different collective goals through similar methods. Individualism does not deny common purposes. People can agree to finance defense, roads, sanitation, or assistance for the poor. The distinction is that a liberal order limits collective action to fields where sufficient agreement exists and leaves individuals free to use their own resources for the many purposes on which society does not agree. A competitive market is valuable because it permits cooperation among people who have different ultimate ends. They need not agree on a common conception of the good life in order to exchange and coordinate. Hayek rejects the claim that competition means absence of planning. Every household, firm, association, and individual plans. The issue is who plans for whom. Under competition, Many separate plans are coordinated through prices and general rules. Under collectivism, one central authority must integrate these activities into a single plan. The disagreement is therefore between decentralized planning by many actors and centralized planning imposed on society as a whole. Nor does competition require government to tolerate every monopoly, external cost, or abuse. Hayek explicitly allows government action where general legal rules can improve the conditions under which competition operates, or where some services cannot be priced effectively. The liberal criterion is whether authorities create a framework that leaves people to choose among alternatives, or whether they decide the particular allocation of resources and opportunities. He is especially critical of proposals for competitive socialism that retain nominal consumer choice or simulated prices, while placing productive resources under central ownership. If the authority controls the resources, it must ultimately decide where they go, which industries expand, which investments are made, and whose projects are denied. The price mechanism loses its independent coordinating function because the politically determined plan remains decisive. The practical importance of individualism is thus pluralism. Modern societies contain too many values, ambitions, beliefs, and circumstances to rank them all on one agreed scale. Competition is a method for allowing incompatible priorities to coexist. Collectivism converts those differences into a political problem that someone must settle authoritatively. Chapter 4. The Inevitability of Planning. Hayek challenges the widespread argument that modern technology itself makes centralized planning unavoidable. Advocates of planning often claim that industry naturally concentrates, competition becomes technically obsolete, and governments are therefore forced to choose between private monopoly and public direction. Hayek replies that the historical evidence does not justify this inevitability. Monopoly often results from policy, tariffs, licensing, cartelization, and deliberate protection as much as from technology. Even where large-scale production lowers costs, it does not follow that one firm must serve an entire economy or that central planning is superior. The relevant comparison is among actual institutional arrangements, not between imperfect competition and an imaginary planner with complete knowledge. Public policy can sometimes preserve competition by removing legal barriers, rather than by replacing markets. More fundamentally, increasing economic complexity strengthens the case for decentralization. Modern production involves an enormous and constantly changing body of local knowledge. No central staff can possess all the information about particular resources, technologies, needs, alternatives, and circumstances that is distributed among individuals and firms. The price system coordinates this knowledge without requiring anyone to comprehend the whole. Hayek describes this as one of the great, often unnoticed achievements of civilization. The division of labor did not reach its modern scale because a mind designed it. It expanded because institutions allowed people to adjust to signals generated by the actions of others. The more complicated the economy becomes, the less plausible it is that conscious direction can substitute for this decentralized process. Complexity is therefore not an argument for planning, but one of the main reasons why planning encounters severe informational limits. Finally, he emphasizes the political role of ideas. Planning can become inevitable in a self-fulfilling sense when decades of policy deliberately weaken competition and then point to the resulting monopolies as proof that competition no longer works. Institutions respond to beliefs. The advance of planning is not an impersonal technological destiny. It is a political choice shaped by theories about how society ought to be organized. Chapter 5. Planning and Democracy. Hayek now turns from economics to political procedure. A comprehensive economic plan means more than the government deciding a few broad goals. It means deciding how society's resources will be used among innumerable competing purposes. Housing must be balanced against factories, consumption against investment, one region against another, one occupation against another, and immediate needs against future projects. These choices are not purely technical because they depend on judgments about which ends matter most. Democracy, however, works best where people can agree on general rules while disagreeing about particular purposes. A parliament can often reach agreement that contracts should be enforced, taxes should follow stated rules, or fraud should be punished. It is far harder for a large society to agree on a complete ranking of millions of concrete economic claims. The more detailed the plan, the more decisions must be made for which no genuine majority exists. This produces pressure to delegate, Legislatures are accused of being slow, argumentative, or technically incompetent, and authority is transferred to commissions, experts, ministers, or executives. Hayek does not object to all delegation. Every modern government needs administrative agencies. The danger appears when experts are empowered not merely to apply general rules, but to decide the substantive priorities that democratic disagreement has failed to resolve. Calling those decisions technical disguises their political nature. An engineer may know the best way to build a dam once society has chosen the project, but expertise alone cannot determine whether the dam is more important than housing, education, consumer goods, military spending, or a different region's needs. To answer such questions, planners must adopt a hierarchy of values. If citizens disagree, the authority must choose among them. Hayek argues that comprehensive planning therefore tends to conflict with democratic procedure, not because planners are necessarily anti-democratic, but because democracy places limits on decisive centralized action. A government committed to a detailed plan will repeatedly encounter opposition from groups whose priorities differ from the official scheme. If the plan is to remain coherent, those objections cannot always be accommodated. The temptation grows to treat deliberation, judicial review, parliamentary delay, local autonomy, and private choice as obstacles to necessary action. The problem becomes sharper when supporters of planning insist that society has already agreed on broad ideals, such as equality, security, or the general welfare. Agreement on these words does not imply agreement on their concrete meaning. People may all favor fairness while disagreeing intensely about wages, taxes, investment, occupational preferences, regional development, or the sacrifices required to achieve particular outcomes. A plan must translate vague agreement into specific winners and losers. He rejects the hope that planning can be confined to a neutral economic sphere. Once the state controls investment and production, political decisions determine which occupations grow, which regions receive resources, which goods are available, and which organizations can function. Economic and political power become intertwined. A democracy can survive extensive public activity, but it becomes increasingly strained when the state assumes responsibility for directing the whole economic order toward a single plan. Chapter 6. Planning and the Rule of Law. For Hayek, the rule of law means that government uses coercion according to general rules announced in advance, rather than according to ad hoc judgments about particular people. Individuals should be able to know the legal framework and make their own plans within it. The law may restrict what everyone can do, but it should not ordinarily tell specific people what ends they must pursue or manipulate rules to produce predetermined outcomes for identified groups. This ideal is never perfect, yet it marks a basic difference between a free order and arbitrary government. General rules limit official discretion. If the state prohibits fraud, requires safety standards, or defines property and contract in a uniform way, individuals can adjust their behavior without needing permission for every action. By contrast, an authority directing production must continually decide who may produce what, at what price, in what quantity, with which resources, and for whose benefit. Comprehensive planning is therefore difficult to reconcile with the rule of law, because the planner cannot know in advance all the circumstances that will require adjustment. The whole point of planning is to direct resources toward particular results. Rules must change as conditions change, and officials must discriminate among cases in light of the plan's priorities. Discretion becomes essential rather than exceptional. Hayek distinguishes formal rules from substantive commands. A formal rule is framed without knowing exactly which individual will gain from it. It creates a predictable field within which people choose. A substantive command aims at a particular result, and therefore must take account of the identities and circumstances of those affected. The more government is asked to guarantee a specific distribution of income or resources, the more it must treat people differently according to official judgments of need, merit, or usefulness. This does not mean that every general law is wise or that every regulation violates liberty. Building regulations, factory laws, rules against deception, and many other permanent constraints can be compatible with liberal principles when they apply generally and are not designed to favor particular persons. Hayek's concern is with the shift from rules governing a process to commands designed to engineer definite outcomes. Equality before the law is central because it deliberately ignores many differences among people. A general rule may produce unequal results, but it does not require the state to rank individuals continuously. A planned system seeks greater equality of outcome, or a socially preferred distribution, and to achieve it must often abandon formal equality. The authority has to decide that one person's need, occupation, industry, or project deserves resources more than another's. The deepest value of the rule of law is that it limits the state's knowledge and purpose. Government deliberately refrains from deciding the precise use individuals will make of their freedom. That restraint allows people to pursue ends no authority has foreseen. Planning reverses the principle by treating social outcomes as objects to be consciously designed. In doing so, it necessarily expands discretionary power. Chapter 7. Economic Control and Totalitarianism. Supporters of planning sometimes concede that economic direction requires centralized authority, but insist that political and personal freedom can remain untouched. Hayek argues that this separation is impossible because economic life provides the material means for nearly every other human purpose. To control those means is to acquire power over choices that extend far beyond consumption. People do not value money or economic activity for their own sake alone. Income allows them to choose where to live, what work to accept, which causes to support, how to educate children, how to spend leisure, which books or newspapers to buy, and how much risk to take. The market gives individuals access to a variety of means without requiring them to persuade an authority that their purposes are socially important. In a planned economy, scarcity still exists. Someone must decide which goods are produced, which occupations receive resources, where workers are assigned, and whose demands are postponed. If the government is the principal or sole employer, control over employment becomes a powerful instrument of discipline. A person who disagrees with official policy may retain a formal right to speak, but face difficulty obtaining work, housing, supplies, or professional advancement. Hayek illustrates the point through occupational choice. Under competition, a person whose talents are unusual or whose preferences do not fit standard categories may sometimes find an employer willing to make a special arrangement. He may accept lower pay in exchange for a preferred job or work irregular hours because he values the occupation strongly. A central authority fixing wages and allocating labor must instead use standardized criteria and decide which candidates are most suitable. Individual intensity of preference can become irrelevant. Planning also affects consumption because production decisions determine what choices exist. If the authority decides that resources should go to public housing rather than private homes, trains rather than automobiles, collective recreation rather than private leisure, those choices shape personal life. The promise that only economic freedom will be surrendered misunderstands how deeply economic means are connected to non-economic ends. Hayek does not claim that markets give everyone equal power. Wealth affects the range of choices available, and poverty can severely limit freedom in practice. His comparison is institutional. Under a competitive order, economic power is dispersed among many owners and employers. A person denied an opportunity by one actor may seek another. Political power is different because the state claims a monopoly of coercion. Combining control over economic resources with political authority creates a concentration of power that private wealth ordinarily lacks. This is why Hayek considers the distinction between political and economic dictatorship unstable. The planner may begin with the intention of directing only production, but to carry out the plan he must influence occupations, consumption, mobility, communication, and the use of leisure. The totalitarian danger lies not in an explicit desire to regulate every aspect of life at the outset, but in the functional consequences of making all important material means dependent on a unified authority. Chapter 8. Whom? Hayek turns to distribution. One of the strongest arguments for planning is dissatisfaction with the unequal and often apparently arbitrary results of competition. Market outcomes do not reward people according to a universally accepted measure of moral merit. Luck, timing, inherited circumstances, scarce talents, consumer preferences, and changing technology all affect incomes. The system can therefore seem blind and unjust. Hayek does not deny this. His defense of competition is precisely that no person or authority consciously decides the complete distribution. The market's impersonality resembles the formal rule of law. People know that outcomes are uncertain, but no planner must first rank the moral worth of every participant. The alternative is not a world without inequality. It is a world in which someone has to determine which inequalities are justified. A planned economy must answer Lenin's famous political question, who gets what from whom? If prices, wages, investment, and production no longer emerge primarily through decentralized exchange, they become objects of political decision. The state must determine the relative claims of miners and teachers, farmers and industrial workers, skilled and unskilled labor, large families and small families, old industries and new industries, regions, professions, and organizations. Appeals to social justice do not resolve the conflict because people disagree about what justice requires. Some emphasize need, others effort, training, unpleasant work, social usefulness, equality, seniority, family responsibility, or productivity. A comprehensive distribution cannot embody all these criteria simultaneously. The planner must choose among them. Hayek argues that this politicizes economic life. Groups have strong incentives to organize politically in order to improve their position in the official hierarchy. The struggle for income becomes a struggle for state favor. Instead of impersonal market changes, people experience gains and losses as deliberate decisions by authorities or as victories by rival groups. Resentment, therefore, shifts toward political power. The issue is not eliminated by democratic voting. A majority can agree that income should be more equal without agreeing on the precise sacrifices required from particular groups. Once specific distributions are at stake, coalitions form. Organized groups try to secure protection, subsidies, wage advantages, licenses, or privileged access. Those who lose may regard the outcome not as an impersonal result, but as political discrimination. He also warns that the ideal of material equality can conflict with formal equality. To make unequal people equal in outcome, government must treat them unequally. Conversely, applying the same general rules may produce unequal results. A society must choose which kind of equality it prioritizes. Hayek believes equality before the law is compatible with freedom because it limits arbitrary coercion. Equality imposed through detailed economic allocation requires much broader discretion. The phrase whom therefore captures the political essence of planning. Once society is organized around conscious distribution, every economic relationship raises the question of who has enough power to decide another person's position. The central problem becomes not whether planning will use power, but who will wield it and according to whose values. Chapter 9. Security and Freedom. Hayek begins by conceding that economic security can be a genuine condition of effective freedom. A person constantly threatened by starvation, sickness, or sudden destitution may have little practical independence. The political question is therefore not whether security matters, but what kind of security government should guarantee, and by what means. He distinguishes two very different ideas. The first is protection against severe physical deprivation and risks that individuals cannot reasonably bear alone. A wealthy society can provide a minimum income or social insurance against sickness, accident, and similar misfortune without directing the whole economy. Hayek regards this type of limited security as compatible with freedom. The second idea is security of a particular income, job, status, or standard of living relative to others. To guarantee that kind of security, government must protect people against the economic consequences of change. It must decide which occupations deserve to be preserved, whose wages may fall, which industries may contract, and who should bear the resulting costs. Such guarantees cannot be universal in a changing economy, because protecting one group often shifts insecurity onto another. Hayek sees this conflict in policies that preserve particular jobs or incomes regardless of changing demand. If some workers are insulated from competition, consumers pay more, taxpayers subsidize the protection, or excluded workers bear the cost. The protected group gains security precisely because others are made to absorb more uncertainty. Political power then determines whose security counts. The connection to freedom becomes especially dangerous when the state is the dominant employer. A private worker who loses one job may seek another. In a system where employment is centrally allocated, exclusion from work can become exclusion from the means of life. Hayek cites the logic that when the state is sole employer, obedience becomes closely connected to access to livelihood. Formal civil rights lose much of their force if economic survival depends on political approval. He also argues that societies must preserve willingness to accept change. Technological progress and shifting consumer preferences inevitably make some skills less valuable and create new opportunities elsewhere. A system that promises everyone permanent protection from these changes will have to prevent the changes themselves or allocate their costs coercively. The resulting rigidity can reduce prosperity while increasing political conflict. Hayek is not indifferent to the hardships created by market adjustment. He believes public policy should reduce the worst consequences and help people through transitions. His objection is to transforming temporary assistance into a promise that government will maintain each person's existing economic position. That promise generates claims the state cannot satisfy simultaneously without directing occupations and incomes. The deeper moral point is that freedom necessarily includes uncertainty. A society in which no one can lose a position may also be one in which no one can freely choose among changing opportunities. Security can be enlarged up to a point without sacrificing liberty, but absolute economic security is incompatible with a system in which individuals make independent decisions whose outcomes are not centrally guaranteed. Chapter 10. Why the Worst Get on Top. Hayek now addresses one of the most disturbing questions in the book. Suppose a planned system is genuinely necessary. Why assume that it must be run by cruel or dishonest people? Could not decent democratic leaders use centralized power benevolently? Hayek's answer is not that good people never enter politics. It is that comprehensive collectivist organization creates selection pressures that favor leaders willing to use methods more conscientious people resist. A planner must begin with a unified hierarchy of social ends. But modern societies contain deep disagreements about religion, morality, distribution, culture, and the good life. The larger and more diverse the population, the harder it is to secure agreement on a detailed positive program. A political movement seeking comprehensive direction, therefore, needs a large group whose members can be brought behind a relatively simple common creed. Hayek argues that such unity is easiest to construct among people whose standards are relatively undemanding, or whose political views can be reduced to a few emotionally powerful propositions. This is not a claim that less educated people are morally inferior. The point is organizational. A movement that requires intense agreement on many issues will have difficulty recruiting people with highly differentiated and independent beliefs. The next step is negative cohesion. It is often easier to unite a group around hostility toward an enemy than around a precise constructive program. Jews, capitalists, kulaks, foreigners, class enemies, or other designated groups can be blamed for social failures. Hatred supplies common purpose where positive agreement is weak. Totalitarian movements, therefore, gain from dividing the world into a virtuous in-group and a threatening out-group. A third selection mechanism concerns moral restraint. Comprehensive planning inevitably creates conflicts in which some people must be coerced for the sake of the plan. Leaders unwilling to deceive, intimidate, confiscate, censor, or punish opponents will repeatedly find themselves at a disadvantage against rivals prepared to do so. Once politics is judged mainly by achievement of the collective end, actions formerly regarded as immoral can be justified as necessary means. Hayek emphasizes the transformation of morality under collectivism. Traditional individualist ethics place limits on what may be done to a person even for desirable social purposes. Collectivist ethics tends to evaluate actions according to their contribution to the group's goal. Loyalty, obedience, discipline, and willingness to sacrifice outsiders become virtues. The distinction between private morality and political necessity widens. This does not mean that collectivists consciously desire cruelty. Many enter the movement precisely because they want justice. But the leader who promises to respect every dissenting conscience may be unable to implement the common plan. The leader who treats opposition as sabotage can act more decisively. Institutions, therefore, reward ruthlessness. Hayek's broader thesis is that concentrated power does not merely corrupt whoever happens to hold it. The kind of task assigned to power affects who is likely to acquire and retain it. A political system demanding comprehensive direction selects for qualities useful in exercising comprehensive control. The worst get on top not by historical accident alone, but because the structure gives them comparative advantages. Chapter 11. The End of Truth. A totalitarian plan cannot rely indefinitely on naked force. To function efficiently, citizens must come to believe that the official goals are their own. The government, therefore, acquires a strong incentive to shape information, education, language, and public interpretation of reality. Hayek argues that propaganda in a planned society differs from ordinary political persuasion because the state's economic and political monopoly gives it unusual power to make one interpretation dominant. When schools, publishing, broadcasting, employment, and organized social life are tied closely to public authority, dissenting views lose the independent institutional basis from which they might compete. The first casualty is the idea of objective truth. Facts that support the plan are emphasized. Facts that threaten it are suppressed or reinterpreted. If production falls below target, the failure may be blamed on sabotage rather than on the plan itself. If two official claims conflict, History can be rewritten to preserve the current line. Truth becomes subordinate to political usefulness. This tendency is not limited to obvious political slogans. Science itself can be pressured to conform to ideology when research has implications for the official worldview. Hayek points to examples from totalitarian states where disciplines were classified according to whether they served approved social goals. Once the state claims authority to coordinate all activity, there is no principled boundary protecting intellectual inquiry from planning. Language also changes. Words such as freedom, justice, democracy, and truth may be retained while their meanings are altered to fit the collective creed. A regime can therefore claim to defend liberty while defining liberty as participation in the officially chosen social purpose. The vocabulary of older ideals survives while their institutional content disappears. Hayek regards education as especially vulnerable because a planned society needs citizens whose aspirations fit available positions. If economic allocation is centrally organized, unrestricted encouragement of personal ambitions can create expectations the plan cannot satisfy. Education, therefore, tends to become an instrument for directing people towards socially approved roles and values. The broader issue is the relationship between pluralism and knowledge. In a free society, competing institutions and opinions expose one another's errors. No single authority needs to decide which interpretation of events everyone must accept. This process can be messy and full of misinformation, but it leaves room for correction. A totalitarian system removes that competition precisely because disagreement threatens unity. Hayek concludes that control of thought is not an accidental excess added after economic planning. A government responsible for a comprehensive social plan has practical reasons to cultivate agreement about both ends and facts. Once the state must make everyone serve one system of purposes, independent truth becomes politically dangerous whenever it conflicts with that system. Chapter 12. The Socialist Roots of Nazism. Hayek challenges the common interpretation of National Socialism as a purely irrational revolt against socialism and modern thought. He argues that Nazi ideology emerged from a long intellectual reaction against liberalism in which socialist and nationalist ideas increasingly converged. The crucial shift was away from individualism, competition, internationalism, and limited government toward organized collective power. He traces this development through German thinkers who attacked classical liberal economics and celebrated the state, national community, planned production, and the subordination of individual interests. Some writers began on the socialist left and later moved toward nationalist doctrines. Others tried to combine socialism with German militarism. The boundary between radical nationalism and anti-liberal socialism became increasingly porous. Hayek gives particular attention to the experience of the First World War. Germany's wartime economy required extensive controls over production, labor, trade, and consumption. Many intellectuals interpreted the apparent efficiency and unity of wartime organization as evidence that a planned economy was superior to liberal capitalism. The war, therefore, provided a model of national economic mobilization that could be carried into peacetime. The concept of socialism itself changed in this environment. It no longer necessarily meant worker ownership or international class solidarity. It could mean the deliberate organization of the national economy by the state, the replacement of private competitive purposes by national goals, and the demand that individuals serve the collective. In this sense, a nationalist socialism could oppose Marxism while retaining a deeply collectivist structure. Hayek cites figures associated with what later came to be called conservative revolutionary thought, along with former socialists who rejected liberal democracy. Their importance lies less in any single doctrine than in the erosion of the intellectual barriers separating left-wing planning from right-wing authoritarianism. Both could condemn bourgeois individualism, parliamentary compromise, international trade, and the alleged chaos of competition. He also stresses that German business support for Nazism does not prove that Nazism was simply capitalism defending itself. Businessmen operating in an increasingly interventionist and cartelized economy had incentives to seek state protection and influence. The result was not restoration of a competitive market order, but deeper political direction of economic life. Hayek's thesis is deliberately controversial. Nazism is not the inevitable result of every socialist idea, and democratic socialists need not share Nazi goals. But the intellectual road to Nazism was prepared in part by doctrines that made collectivist organization appear morally superior to liberal individualism. Once society accepts that a common end justifies comprehensive control, the specific identity of that end can change from class to nation, without requiring an equally profound change in institutional method. The warning to Britain is therefore historical. Ideas that seem progressive because they opposed fascism could still weaken the liberal principles whose disappearance had made fascism possible. To defeat National Socialism politically, while adopting a similar contempt for competition, pluralism, and limited government, would be to misunderstand the intellectual history of the enemy. Chapter 13. The Totalitarians in Our Midst. Hayek's warning becomes most immediate in this chapter. British readers, he says, look at Nazi Germany and assume the distance between the two societies is too great for comparison to be useful. But Germany itself had once possessed a vigorous intellectual culture, constitutional institutions, private property, and a large educated middle class. If one studies only the final dictatorship, the earlier stages that made it possible disappear from view. Hayek therefore examines ideas circulating in wartime Britain that he believes resemble earlier German arguments for comprehensive organization. He quotes writers, planners, scientists, public officials, and political advocates who call for permanent economic direction, compulsory national service, industrial organization by large monopolistic bodies, centralized control of investment, or the continuation of wartime planning after peace returns. His concern is not that these people secretly admire Hitler, most explicitly oppose fascism. The similarity lies in the institutional assumptions behind their proposals. War naturally requires exceptional coordination. A country fighting for survival may ration goods, direct production, mobilize labor, and sacrifice ordinary liberties to a single overwhelming purpose. Hayek argues that the danger comes when people infer from wartime necessity that the same organization is desirable for normal civil life. War solves the problem of disagreement by providing one obvious priority: victory. Peace restores the diversity of individual ends that makes comprehensive planning politically contentious. He is particularly critical of the belief that scientific expertise can determine social policy in the same way science solves a technical problem. Scientists possess specialized knowledge, but specialization does not give them authority to rank society's competing ends. A physicist can explain how to build a weapon or power station. He cannot derive from physics whether resources should go there rather than to housing, art, education, or private consumption. When experts claim wider authority, scientific prestige can become a vehicle for political planning. Hayek also attacks the idea that industrial concentration should be encouraged, because large organizations are easier for the state to coordinate. This replaces competition with an alliance between bureaucracy and monopoly. Private managers may retain nominal ownership, yet their investment, prices, production, and employment become increasingly subject to public direction. Conversely, officials depend on large organized industries to execute policy. Economic and political power become mutually reinforcing. A further danger lies in the language of national efficiency. Calls to organize the whole country as if it were one factory may sound practical, but a society is not a single-purpose organization. A factory has a defined end and can require employees to contribute to it while they are at work. A nation contains people with conflicting beliefs and purposes. To treat it as a single organization means deciding which of those purposes are legitimate and compelling everyone to serve the chosen hierarchy. Hayek acknowledges that Britain's political traditions make totalitarianism far from inevitable. His purpose is to identify early intellectual changes before coercive consequences become obvious. When people begin to regard independent economic action as socially irresponsible, parliamentary disagreement as obstruction, competition as waste, and centralized organization as the natural mark of modernity, they are changing the moral assumptions on which free institutions depend. The chapter's message is therefore not that Britain already is totalitarian. It is that totalitarian institutions can be prepared intellectually by people who would be horrified by their final use. A free society needs to recognize the value of decentralized disorder, disagreement, and limits on power before crises make centralized alternatives attractive. Chapter 14. Material Conditions and Ideal Ends. Hayek now asks why societies that value liberty nevertheless accept growing economic direction. One reason, he argues, is the increasing importance attached to material improvement. Modern progress has made people expect continuous rises in living standards, and political movements promise that planning can accelerate them. Economic organization is then treated as a technical instrument for securing prosperity, while liberty appears as a secondary value that can be temporarily compromised. Hayek rejects the assumption that greater material wealth automatically justifies greater coercion. The purpose of economic freedom is not to elevate money above every other value. It is to allow individuals to decide for themselves how material means should serve religious, intellectual, family, artistic, charitable, or personal ends. When authorities take control of economic choices, they gain influence over those supposedly higher values as well. He is especially skeptical of claims that people will willingly surrender freedom only in economic matters, because those matters are less noble. Economic decisions are often precisely the means through which individuals express non-economic priorities. A person may accept a lower income to pursue a vocation, support a political cause, live in a preferred place, care for family, or maintain independence. A planner who maximizes aggregate output may regard such choices as inefficient. Hayek also discusses the moral effects of economic progress. The liberal order produced wealth partly because it allowed people to experiment, innovate, and pursue opportunities no authority had foreseen. Yet once a higher standard of life is achieved, citizens can become unwilling to accept the insecurity and unevenness associated with the process that produced it. They demand guarantees that may reduce the flexibility required for further progress. Hayek returns to the issue of ends and means. Collectivist systems frequently justify restrictions as temporary necessities for achieving a better future. But once coercive institutions are established, they acquire their own interests and routines. Sacrifices made in the name of future freedom can create structures that make freedom progressively harder to restore. He also warns against moral arrogance toward earlier liberal generations. 20th century people often regard 19th century individualism as materialistic, yet the earlier tradition deliberately limited government because it recognized that spiritual and moral diversity cannot be planned. A political order that leaves economic choices decentralized may appear less morally ambitious, but its restraint protects the space in which individuals can pursue ideals that differ from official priorities. The chapter therefore reverses a common accusation. Planning is often defended as a way to subordinate economics to higher social purposes. Hayek argues that comprehensive planning instead makes more of life dependent on economic administration, because every project requires permission and resources from the plan. The free market, by dispersing control over material means, can create greater independence for non-material ends. Chapter 15. The prospects of international order. Hayek extends the argument beyond the nation-state. The Second World War will eventually end, and the victors will face the question of how to organize peace. He fears that proposals for international economic planning will reproduce at a larger scale the political problems already discussed within nations. Economic nationalism, protectionism, and attempts at national self-sufficiency helped destroy the 19th century international order. When governments control trade and production to serve national plans, economic relationships across borders become matters of political bargaining. Imports and exports are no longer mainly exchanges among private actors. They become instruments of state policy. Disputes over resources, markets, and employment therefore acquire geopolitical significance. Hayek argues that an international planning authority would need extraordinary power. To equalize living standards, direct investment, or allocate raw materials among nations, it would have to decide which countries should develop which industries, whose consumption should be reduced, which populations deserve higher incomes, and where scarce capital should go. These are politically explosive questions, even within a single nation, whose citizens share language and institutions. Agreement would be far harder across countries with different histories, values, and levels of wealth. A global planner would therefore face a choice between impotence and coercion. If it lacked power, national governments would ignore decisions they disliked. If it possessed enough power to impose the plan, it would become an authority of unprecedented scope, with little realistic democratic control. Hayek considers the idea especially dangerous because people may accept such authority in the hope of preventing war without asking how its decisions could be legitimized. His preferred direction is federalism. A federation divides power between levels of government and restricts the central authority to functions on which broad agreement is possible, especially peace, common defense, and the maintenance of general rules for international economic relations. It does not attempt to direct the detailed economic life of every member society. Federalism is attractive to Hayek precisely because it makes comprehensive planning more difficult. Economic policies that discriminate heavily among regions or groups become harder to sustain when authority is divided and people can move across jurisdictions. A federal framework can prevent states from using trade barriers and coercive economic nationalism against one another, while leaving substantial local autonomy. He recognizes that federation requires some surrender of national sovereignty. That is its purpose. National sovereignty allows governments to manipulate trade, currency, and economic controls in ways that can create conflict with neighbors. A durable peace may require binding states to common rules, but the central authority should be limited by the same liberal principle that applies within nations. It should establish a framework rather than impose a complete hierarchy of substantive ends. Hayek is skeptical of the idea that international economic planning can eliminate rivalry by rationally allocating resources. If every distributional question becomes a political decision, international politics may become even more bitter. A poorer country can claim a right to transfers from richer ones. An industrial country may be told to reduce production for another's benefit. Populations may reject sacrifices decided by distant officials. Without a deep common scale of values, the authority can resolve such disputes only through power. He therefore distinguishes international law from international administration. Peace requires rules against aggression, mechanisms for settling disputes, and institutions strong enough to enforce agreed limits. It does not require a world government directing ordinary economic life. The more ambitious the international organization becomes in choosing specific outcomes, the more resistance it is likely to provoke. The post-war opportunity, in Hayek's view, is to construct an international framework that limits both national economic warfare and supranational central planning. Federation can restrain sovereign power while preserving pluralism. The goal is not a perfectly designed global economy, but an order in which many societies and individuals can pursue different aims under common rules. Chapter 16. Conclusion. Hayek closes by refusing to offer a detailed blueprint for the society that should replace wartime controls. The book has been primarily critical because he believes the urgent task is to recover principles rather than design a complete social plan. A free society cannot itself be constructed as a finished blueprint without contradicting the freedom it is meant to protect. The central lesson is that progress depends on limiting coercive power, preserving individual choice, and allowing institutions to evolve through experimentation. Liberalism must not be confused with defending every inherited economic arrangement. It should remain open to reform, social protection, and new rules where experience shows they are needed. But reform should preserve the distinction between general rules and discretionary direction of individual lives. Hayek admits that the earlier liberal order was incomplete and often failed to solve serious social problems. The answer is not nostalgia. It is to learn from both its achievements and the catastrophes produced by later attempts at comprehensive organization. The 20th century has shown that civilization can move backward when the desire to control outcomes becomes stronger than the willingness to tolerate pluralism and uncertainty. He ends with a deliberately simple principle. A policy that protects the freedom of the individual remains genuinely progressive because it leaves open the possibility of development no authority can foresee. The task after the war is not to perfect mankind through centralized direction, but to rebuild institutions in which free people can again make their own plans and correct their errors.